Hi, welcome back to the course. In the previous two sections, we discussed about the new module, which is the category module. We created the category module and also we have integrated with the expense module. We created few API endpoints for category module, which is reading the categories and creating the categories, also deleting the category. While developing these API endpoints, we have also created a few Java objects, which is the IO objects and the DTO objects and the entity objects. And also we understand that we are going to copy the values of one object to the another object using the builder pattern. Let me open the IntelliJ, and if I open one of the controller, which is the expense controller, and if you scroll down, you can see we have created the private methods, and inside the private methods we are copying the values from one object to the another object. For example, expense DTO to the expense response object. For that we have used the builder pattern. If you look at these private methods, inside these methods we have not written any logic. We just copying the values from one object to the another object. This is completely fine if you have a small application and if you have a Java object which contains 5 to 10 fields. But think of it, if you are creating the enterprise application and every Java object has 100 and 200 fields, we cannot do something like this. We cannot copy all those 100 field values from one object to the another object. That will take a lot of time and also it consumes a lot of lines of code. We need some way to copy the values from one object to the another object. The one way is we can use the Java libraries, the mapper libraries, so that it will take care of copying the values from one object to the another object. That's exactly in this section we are going to learn. We will look at some of the Java mapping libraries which is provided by Java ecosystem, and in that we will choose one of the best library and we will see how we can map the objects from one object to the another objects. In this video, let's discuss the Java mapping library. Java ecosystem provided a bunch of mapping libraries, out of which we will discuss some of the most popular mapping libraries. The first mapping library is MapStruct library. This is one of the most popular mapping library. It is widely used in the industry. If you are creating a large scale and robust application, this is the library that you can use. It is easy to use and it provides a bunch of other features as well. We will discuss along the way, and we are going to use this MapStruct library in our expense tracker API. The second mapper library is JMapper library. It is also one of the most popular mapping library. You can also use this, you can explore more on this, but we are not going to use this library in our course. And the last one is the model mapper library. It is also a simple and intelligent object mapping mapper library. It is also used in small scale applications. You can also use this. It is also easy to use. You can just Google it and you can read more about the model mapper. The documentation is also really good. And why are we choosing this MapStruct library? Like I said before, it is widely used in the industry and it provides a bunch of features as well. And most importantly, in the performance wise, MapStruct is the clearly winner. You can read this article. I attach a link in the description section of this video. If you scroll down, you can see the average time for this library is almost very less compared to the other mapping libraries. The MapStruct is the clear winner in the average time for the conversion, and also for the throughput you can see the MapStruct is the clear winner. Similarly, for the single shot time, MapStruct is the clear winner. So this is why we are going to use this MapStruct library, and as I said before, it is widely used in the industry. So if you join any new team, and most of the teams will be using this MapStruct library. I personally use this and it is very excellent and it is easy to configure it. Alright, now we have understand the different mapping libraries, and out of which we are going to use this MapStruct library in our application. In the next video, let's configure this MapStruct library and we will start copying the objects from one object to the another object. Let's continue in the next video. In this video, let's configure the MapStruct library. Before that, I have created a new branch which is version 2.1 from the master branch, and also inside our application.properties file, I have also changed the servlet context path to version 2.1. And also inside our Postman, I have changed the initial value and the current value to version 2.1. Awesome. Before we configure the MapStruct library, let's see, is there any way that we can copy the values from one object to the another object? Is there any way that the Spring team has provided a support for copying the values from one object to the another object? Of course, there is a way. The Spring team has provided a util class which is the BeanUtils, and we can use that to copy the values from one object to the another object. But there is a few drawback in that. Let's see. First, let's see how we can use that. Let's take an example of this create expense API. So if you scroll down, we have this post mapping. It is going to create the API, and we are returning the expense response object. For that, we are going to calling this private method which is map to response object. This is going to take the expense DTO as a parameter. What I will do is I'm going to just comment everything, and I'm going to make use of the BeanUtils. BeanUtils, it is going to provide a method called copy properties, and to this we can pass the source object and the target object, so that it will copy the values from source object to the target object. In our case, the source object is expense DTO, and the target object is, we need to create a new object for this expense response. So let's create a new object, expense response. And we can pass the expense response as a second parameter. Now it is going to copy all the values from expense DTO to the expense response object. And finally, we need to return the expense response and save this. With this, now let me start the application. Before that, let's go to the database. Okay, let's open the database. Let's open the localhost. I'm going to increase the font. Let me execute the user table. We have two users, Bharat and Bhushan, and also let's execute the expenses table. We have few expenses. Let me also see the categories table. We have few categories. I'm going to empty the category, the expense table as well as the category table. Let me select all these records and delete it. Let's start from the scratch. So also for the categories table, let's delete this record. Click on the supply and close it. Awesome. Now let's go back to the IntelliJ and let's start the application. The application is started on the port 8080. Let's go to the Postman and open the login API, and we have the bushan@example.com and password is 123456. Let me click on this send. We get the JWT token back and open the create category. First we need to create the category, and I'm going to create the category with savings as a category name. Click send. A new category has been created. We can copy the category ID and go to the create expense. We have this create expense, and I'm going to add the expense ID. Just add the name as ABC, amount 250, and some description and date you can provide. This is just for the testing. And click on this send, and you can see the resource has been created, but if you look at this category, it is returning null. This is because if you go back to the IntelliJ, we have used this BeanUtils to copy the object from expense DTO to the expense response object. And if you look at the expense DTO object, if you go to the expense DTO, inside this we have the category DTO. This category DTO is a nested object inside the expense DTO, and inside our expense response, we also have the category response. Ideally, the category DTO should copy to the category response, but it didn't do that because when we are copying from one object to the another object using the BeanUtils, if there is a nested object, it is not going to perform the operation. It is not going to copy the values from nested object, one object to the another object. We have to tell explicitly. So this is the problem. The one way to tell is that we have to again create an object for the category response. So let's create the object which is category response. We can call this category response, new category response. And again we can make use of the BeanUtils, BeanUtils.copy properties. We can provide the source which is expense DTO.get category DTO. This category DTO, we are copying it into the category response. And once it is copied, we have to add this category response to the expense response object. So let's add it. We can make use of the expense response dot set category, and to this we can set the category response. Now we can return the expense response. So let me stop the server and I'm going to start the application again. Application is started. Go to the Postman and log into the API and go to the create expense. And now let me change this to XYZ. Oops, this is response. So inside the request body, just add XYZ and hit send. This time we get the category in the response. What we have did, we again created a new object, the nested object we have created, and we are manually copying the properties. This looks good. It will work as expected, but the problem is again our object contains the 100 nested objects, then we might miss out any one of the objects. That time we don't get the expected output. That is the problem. That is why we are going to use a mapper library, the mapper library which will takes care of everything. We just need to add a few configurations and rest everything will be taken care by the mapping library. That is why we are not going to make use of this BeanUtils util class to copy the properties from one object to the another object. In the next video, we can start configuring the MapStruct library and we can do the mapping. Let's continue in the next video. In this video, let us configure the MapStruct library. The configuration is pretty straightforward. Let's go to the browser and navigate to the mapstruct.org, the official website. And if you click on this download, it will take us to this installation section. We need to add this dependency. So let's add the dependency, copy this and go to the IntelliJ and open the pom.xml. Let's add the dependency just after the Jaxby API. We need to provide the version. So go back to the browser. The latest and stable version is 1.6.0 at the time of this recording. Let's add this and you can just click on this reload Maven changes. This is not completed the configuration. We also need to add a few more annotations. Let's go back to the browser and you can see we also need to add this annotation processor path. These annotation processor paths, it is going to generate the additional annotation sources. Also, it is going to add some resources. We just need to add this annotation processors path as well inside this configuration within the build section. So let me copy this configuration, copy this and go back, and just after this artifact ID within the build section, let's add this and we get this error. We can look into this after that. At the end of this video, we can just see why it is throwing these red lines. You can also reload these Maven changes and we need to add the version as well. Scroll up, just copy this 1.6.0 and you can add it here. Alright, next let me remove this comment, and if you go to the browser and if you go to this FAQ section, if you scroll down, you can say, can I use a MapStruct together with the project Lombok? The answer is yes, but there is a condition. If you are using the Lombok 1.18.16 or newer version, you also need to add the Lombok MapStruct binding dependency. This is a dependency that will act as a bridge between the MapStruct library as well as the Lombok library. So we need to add this dependency as well. Let me open this in a new tab. It is take us to the Maven central repository, and just copy this dependency, scroll up, add this dependency, and the version is 0.2.0. Okay, now we added the MapStruct library as well as the Lombok MapStruct binding dependency. Also, we need to add two more annotation processor paths for this Lombok MapStruct binding as well as the Lombok. Let's go back, and if you go to the FAQ section, and you can see an example for using the two projects together can be found here. So let's click on this and open it in a new tab. We have a nice GitHub project for reference. So open the pom.xml, scroll down, you can see we need to add these two as well. So let's copy this and paste it. Also, we need to provide the version. In our case, the version which is 0.2.0. Copy this and add the version. We also need to add the Lombok version, and if you go to the project explorer and if you click on this external libraries and you search for Lombok, you will see we are using 1.18.32. Let me minimize this. We can provide the version 1.18.32. Alright, now we added all the necessary dependencies. Also, we have added the annotation processor paths. Still we are getting this red lines. We will fix it. Before that, let me reload the Maven changes. Alright, we are getting this red lines error. In the next video, we will fix this. This will sometimes happen. There is a process for fixing this. We will continue in the next video. In this video, let us fix these errors. As I said before, this is the most common error that you will face whenever you are configuring this MapStruct library, or also whenever you are adding these annotation processor paths. So there is a Stack Overflow answer for this. Let me pull up that link. I have attached this link in the description section of this video. Make sure to open this link, and you can see there is they have provided the steps how you can resolve this. The first step is to erase the build section on pom.xml. So let's go to the IntelliJ, and first we need to remove this build section. So I'm going to remove this build section and just load the Maven changes, and also you can do clean and install. Okay, we got the build success. This is the first step. Now let's go to the browser and see Maven clean package. This is we have done, and the third step is to add the following code block to pom.xml. We're going to just add this code block, the same code block, but without these annotation processor paths. So let me add that, and also let me remove this version. You don't need this. Let me save this and also do Maven changes, load the Maven changes. And if you go to the browser back, again they are telling to do the Maven clean package and run the application and then stop it. So let's do the same thing. Alright, the build is success. Now let me go back and now add the missing fields to the pom.xml. So we can go to the GitHub repository which we have opened earlier, and just copy this entire configuration block, copy this, and we can paste it here. Oops, I made a mistake. Let's go back and copy this entire configuration block and paste it. Also, let me remove this. Let's remove this, and I'm going to add the version, the MapStruct version. In our case, it's 1.6.0, 1.6.0, and also the Lombok version. In our case, it's 1.18.32, and also this MapStruct binding library version is 0.2.0, 0.2.0. With this, now we are not able to see any of the errors. So let me click on this load Maven changes, and also I'm going to do clean and install. Alright, we got the build success. This is it. Now we have configured the MapStruct in our API. All we need to do is we have to copy the values from one object to the another object. Let's see how we can do that in the following lectures. In this video, let's create the mapper interface. In order to copy from value from one object to the another object, the process is straightforward and it is easy to do that. Everything is provided in the documentation. So let's go to the browser, and if you go to the mapstruct.org, I'm going to open the home page, and if you click on this get started, you can see they have provided the example. First the first step is we need to create this mapper interface, and we need to add the mapper annotation. Let's do that. Go to the IntelliJ. I'm going to create a new package under the base package. Let us call this mapper, or let me change this to mappers. Okay, it is saying that it is already exist. Okay, I have created previously. That's fine. Let me remove this package, which is the mapper package, and inside this mappers, let's create a new interface. We can call this expense mapper because we are going to copy the objects for the expense module. I'm going to call this expense mapper, which is an interface. Create it. I'm going to add it to the Git. Let me expand this. The next step is we need to add the mapper annotation. So let's add the mapper annotation. Next, let's go back to the browser, and the second step is we need to add the method. We need to provide the source object and the destination object from which object to which object we are copying. Let's go to the IntelliJ. Let me go to the expense controller. We need to copy the values from expense DTO to the expense response object. So let's open the expense mapper. We can call this map to expense response, and this is going to take the expense DTO, and this is going to return the expense response. Okay, now we have declared the method. That's it. That's all we need to do. Now the MapStruct library will take care of it. As soon as we compile this, it is going to provide the implementation class for this interface, and it is going to copy all the values from expense DTO to the expense response. We can verify it. Before that, we have to do one more step. If you go to the browser, you can see we need to create an instance of it. So let me copy this, and let me paste it, and let's change this to expense mapper. Let me import this mappers, and let's change this to expense mapper. That's it. Let me save this, and let's open the Maven and expand this, and I'm going to do clean and install. Let it build. You can see the build is success. Now if you open the project explorer and inside this target folder, if you can see we have this folder called generated sources. If you expand this, and you can see we have this expense mapper implementation class. If you open this, inside this you can see it is copying the values from expense DTO to the expense response object. But there is one problem with this. Like I said before, this expense DTO also contains the category DTO, and this expense response also contains the category response, but it is not copying the values from expense DTO to the expense DTO. Inside this expense DTO we have the category DTO. It is not copying the values from category DTO to the category response. We have to tell explicitly. That is because if you go to the value for this expense DTO, inside this expense DTO, the value for this category DTO is category DTO, and inside this expense response we have the value for category. There is a mismatch between the fields. That is why it is not able to copy the values for this category as well. If there is a difference in the field names or the property name, we can tell explicitly to the MapStruct library. So let's go back to the browser, and if you look at this, we can use this add mapping annotation. So let me copy this and go to the IntelliJ, and inside our expense mapper I'm going to add this annotation to this method, and we need to provide the source and target. So in our case the target is expense response. So first of all I'm going to import this this mapping annotation. The target is inside the expense response. The target is category, so we need to provide the field name which is category. Similarly, the source we need to provide from which field we need to copy it to the target field. So in our case, which is present inside this expense DTO, we have to specify fully qualified name, which is expense DTO dot. Using the dot operator we can access the properties. Inside the expense DTO we have the category DTO. So let's add the category DTO. In fact I'm going to copy this. I don't want to mistype it, so let me paste it. Alright, the source we are providing as a category DTO, and the destination or the target we are providing it as a category. Now with this, now let me save this. Now if I go ahead and do clean install, the build is success. Let me let me refresh this. Let me open this expense mapper implementation. This time you can see it also created one more method for category DTO to category response. It is going to copy this category DTO to the category response, and this method they have called inside this method which is map to expense response. So now what we can do is we can make use of this expense mapper. We can create an object for this expense mapper, and we can call this method which is map to expense response. Isn't it awesome, right? So let me close this and let's go to the expense controller. I'm going to get rid of all of this. At the top I'm going to inject the expense mapper, private expense mapper. We can call this mapper, or we can call this expense mapper. We can add the annotation auto wired. We can make use of this expense mapper. Let me scroll down, and we don't need this method at all. So what I'll do is let me undo this. Oops. Let me uncomment this, and I'm going to remove this, and at the top private expense mapper, and we can auto wire it. Now we can make use of this expense mapper. Scroll down inside this post mapping. Instead of returning the map to response, we can make use of the expense mapper dot map to expense response. To this we can pass the expense DTO. That's it. That's all we need to do. So let me save this and I'm going to start the application. We can test the API endpoint. Okay, we are getting some error. We can see what is that error. Field expense mapper that could not be found expense mapper. Okay, all right. I got because this expense mapper, we also need to add it as a component source. So if I open this component model, and we need to tell this is a Spring component model. With this, let me start the application again. This time we should not see any of the errors. Awesome. You can see the Tomcat port has started on the port 8080. We can test the API endpoint. Go to the Postman and open the login API, click send. We have logged into the application and go to the create expense. I'm going to create an expense with some random thing, let's say shopping. All right. So let's change this to shopping and click send. You can see we get the response along with the category object. But we are getting this null, the description, category icon, created at, updated at. That is because we are not setting the values for description, category icon, created at, updated for the category DTO at all. If the category DTO contains these values, it should have copied it to the category response as well. Since it is not copying, since the value is not present inside the category DTO, that is why we are getting the null. Alright, this is how we can use the MapStruct library. In the next video, we can use MapStruct library for other objects as well. Let's continue in the next video. In this video, let us convert the object from expense request to the expense DTO. We have a private method. Let me open the expense controller, and you can see we have this private method that will convert the values from expense request object to the expense DTO. We have used the builder pattern. Instead of this, we can also use the MapStruct to convert the values, to copy the values from one object to the another object. What I'll do is I'm going to first define a method inside this expense mapper. This is going to return the expense DTO back. We can call this map to expense DTO. This will take the expense request as a parameter. We can call this request. And one thing we have to notice here is if you go to the expense request, we have this category ID, and inside the expense DTO, we have the category ID. Either we can map it to this category ID or we can map it to this category DTO.category ID. Inside the category DTO, we have the category ID. I think this is the best way is to just map it to directly to the expense DTO category ID. We can directly map it to here. We don't have to add extra mapping annotation to that. In case if you wanted to map it to this expense DTO.category ID, we can add the add mapping annotation. But in this case, this works as expected. We can verify it. Let me do the Maven clean and install. The build is success. Let me go to the expense mapper implementation. And if you look at this, we have the map to expense DTO. This will take the expense request as a parameter and return the expense DTO. If you scroll down, you can see the category ID is mapped to the expense DTO category ID. Awesome. With this, we can use this method inside our expense controller. Let's go to the expense controller. We have this post mapping annotation. Here we can make use of the expense mapper dot map to expense DTO. To this we can pass the expense request. That's it. Now we can test our implementation. Let me run the application. The application is started. Let's navigate to the Postman. Open the login API, click send. The user is logged in, bushan@example.com, And if you go to the create expense, I'm going to add a new expense, which is something like new expense. This is for the testing purpose, and click send. You can see a new resource has been created, new expense with the expense ID, and we get the category ID as well as the category name, which is savings. Awesome. Let's continue in the next video. In this video, let us copy the values from expense DTO to the expense entity. Inside our expense service implementation, we have this private method which will taken care of copying the values from expense DTO to the expense entity. Let's make use of the MapStruct library. First, let's go to the expense mapper. Here we can define a method. This is going to return the expense entity back, and we can call this map to expense entity, and to this we can pass the expense DTO. We can call this expense DTO. That's it. Now let's go to the expense service implementation. Before that, let's actually do Maven clean and install. So it is going to generate the implementation method for us. Okay, the build is success. Map to expense entity. If you go to the map to expense entity, you can see map to expense entity. It is going to copy all the values from DTO object to the entity object. Awesome. So now let's go to the service implementation, and here inside the save expense details, we are copying the expense DTO to the expense entity object. You can see we have this map to entity. Instead of this, we can use the first at the top. I'm going to inject the expense mapper, private final expense mapper. You can call this expense mapper. And now if you scroll down, here we can make use of the, let me get rid of this, we can use the expense mapper dot map to expense entity, and to this we can pass the expense DTO back. This will give us the new expense, and to this new expense we are adding the category, and we're setting the user, and we're saving into the database. And after this, again we are making use of this private method map to DTO, which is from expense entity object to the DTO object. We can also make use of the MapStruct method. Let's go to the expense mapper, and here we can do map to expense DTO. We already have this expense DTO, but this will take the expense request as a parameter. Here we are going to accept the expense entity as a parameter. Expense and expense. This is going to give us the expense DTO back. Expense DTO. That's it. Let me save this, and we can do a Maven clean and install. You can see we have this build is success. And if you go to the, this is map to expense DTO. If you go to the mapper implementation, we have a new method which is map to expense DTO. You can see it is going to take the expense as a parameter, and it is going to convert it into expense DTO. And if you scroll down here, you can see it is copying all the values. And also one thing we have to notice here, let me open this expense entity, and inside this we have this category object, and we need to copy this category object to the expense DTO, right? We have to copy this also to the expense DTO. Let's go to the expense service implementation, or let's go to the implementation. Here you can see we have this expense object, but this expense object does not copying the category object to the expense DTO category. We have to tell explicitly. What we can do is, let's go to the mapper, and here we can add the annotation mapper. We can provide the target object and the source object. Target, sorry, this should be mapping target and source. In our case, the source, which is expense.category. Let me open this category. So let me copy this category, expense.category. We are going to map it to the, if you go to the expense DTO, we have to map it to this category DTO. So let's copy this and paste it. With this, let me do Maven and clean. The build is success. If you go to the implementation, and this time you can see it has added one more line of code. It is copying the category from the expense. It is going to get the category and it is going to map it to the category object. You can see it is going to map it to the category object. Alright, with this, let me stop it and I'm going to restart the application. Let's go to the expense service implementation, and here we need to change this to expense mapper dot map to expense DTO, and this will takes the new expense as a parameter. That's it. Let me stop the server. Let me restart it again. We can test it one more time. Application is started. Let's go to the Postman. Inside the Postman, first let's log into the application, and now go to the create expense, and now I'm going to change this to new expense 2. Click send. You can see we get the category object as well. This time you can see we are copying, because we are copying everything from the category object to the category, the expense category to the expense DTO. This is why we are getting all the values. Earlier we are getting the null, right? But now we are since copying the entire object, so inside the response also we are getting all the values. Alright, let's continue in the next video. Now that we converted all the objects from related to expense and expense DTO, what we can do is we can remove those private methods and we can directly leverage onto the MapStruct library. Let's go to the expense controller. Let me remove these private methods. This is map to expense response. We don't need this, and also we don't need this as well, and we can remove this. We get some errors. That's completely fine. We can fix it. Do we have any other private methods? Nope. Let's start converting it. This is the map to response object. What we can do is, let me minimize this. Okay, now we can use the expense mapper, and we have this method map to response. Similarly, expense mapper, and we have this map to response. Okay, instead of this we have the map to expense response. To this we can pass the expense DTO. Scroll down, and we don't have anything else inside this delete mapping, also post mapping, and inside this put mapping we can change this to expense mapper dot map to expense DTO, and similarly we can change this to expense mapper dot map to expense response, response. Similarly, we can change this to expense mapper dot map to expense response. Scroll down. This we can change this to map to expense response. Scroll down. Similarly, we can change this to expense response dot map to expense response. Awesome. Okay, we have everything, or do we have any other? Okay, this we can change this to expense response. Awesome. And also, yeah, we fixed everything inside this expense controller. Now let's go to the service implementation. I'm gonna get rid of this map to expense DTO. Similarly, we can remove this, and we can remove this also. Again, we get some errors. That's completely fine. We can fix it. Scroll up. Let's start from the beginning. This we can change it to expense mapper dot map to expense DTO, and scroll down. This just change it to according to the names. That's it. Nothing else inside this method. And scroll down. And do we have anything else? Yes, here we can change this to expense mapper dot map to expense DTO. Alright, scroll down. We can change this also, expense mapper dot map to expense DTO. Scroll down. We can change this as well, expense mapper dot map to expense DTO. Alright, we fixed everything inside this expense service implementation also. Let me stop the server, and I'm going to restart it so that we can test the entire expense module. Application is started. Let's go to the Postman and log into the API and go to the create expense. And create expense, we have already tested it, so let me copy this. We can test the get expense single expense object. Copy this and go to the read expense. This is read expenses. Let's go to the read expense API, and we can pass the expense object. Click send. You can see we get the response back with the category object as well. Awesome. And we can also test the delete API. Let's go to the delete expense, and we can pass the expense ID. Click send. You can see 204, no content, and awesome. Looks like our expense module is working as expected. Next, we have to concentrate on the category module. Inside the category module also, we have the bunch of private methods. We can remove that, and we can leverage on the MapStruct API. Let's continue in the next video. In this video, let's create a new category mapper. Let's open the Project Explorer, and inside the mappers, create a new interface. We can call this category mapper. Let me add this to Git. Now let me expand this, and inside this, first of all, we need to make this as a Spring component mapper. We will add the attribute component model, which is a Spring component model, and also we need to add the instance category mapper. We can call this instance is equal to mappers dot get mapper. Let's define the methods. We have 4 methods. So let's start with map to category entity. Map to category entity. This is going to take the category DTO. Category DTO, we can call this category DTO. This is going to return the category DTO back. Sorry, this is going to return the category entity. category entity. Let me import this. Similarly, we also have map to category DTO, map to category DTO. This will takes the category entity as a parameter. Similarly, we also have map to category DTO, which takes the category request as a parameter. And the last method is map to category response. Let's save this. Now what I'll do is I'm going to do Maven clean and install. So this will generate the implementation class for us. You can see the build is success. We can open the category service, category mapper implementation, and you can see it generated all the methods. We can start using these methods. Alright, let me stop the server. Let's continue in the next video. In this video, let us make use of the mapper methods. Inside our category controller, first of all, I'm going to remove few private methods. We have this map to DTO. We can get rid of this. Similarly, we have this map to response as well. Let's get rid of this. We get some errors, that's completely fine. Similarly, let's go to the service implementation, scroll down, we have this map to user DTO. Let's keep it as it is. This we need, but we don't need this map to DTO. Let's remove this. We also don't need this map to entity. Let me remove this as well. Now at the top, I'm going to inject the category mapper. We can call this category mapper. Scroll down, we can start using it. Category mapper dot map to category DTO. Scroll down here, let's change this to category mapper dot map to category DTO. Here we can change this to category mapper dot map to category DTO. And also, okay, this should be mapper. And also for this save category, we also need to generate UUID as well. So let's use new category ID dot set category ID UUID dot random UUID dot toString, and new category. Also we need to set the user ID, the current user, new category dot set user service dot get logged in user. Awesome. And do we have any other errors? Nope. Let's go to the category controller. Let's do the same thing. Let's inject the category mapper, private final category mapper. Let me import this category mapper. Let's use the category mapper dot map to category DTO, and this we can change this to category mapper dot map to category response. Scroll down, you can change this to category mapper dot map to category response. Scroll down. Okay, we fixed everything. One last piece of thing what we have to do is, if you go to the expense request, sorry, not the expense request, the category request. Let me open the project explorer, go to the IO object, category request. Inside this we have this icon, but when we are mapping it to the X category DTO, if you go to the category DTO, we have the category icon. We have to map this as well. If you go to the category mapper, we can add we have this category request to the category DTO. We can add the mapping annotation. Mapping, let me import the mapping. We need to provide the target and we also need to provide the source. In our case, the source is icon and target is category icon. Let's go to the category DTO. This is category icon. Let me copy this and paste it, and this should be icon. Awesome. With this, let me do clean and install again. Okay, the build is success, and let's minimize this and we can start the application. We can test one last time, then we can wrap up this section. Let's go to the Postman and log into the API. Okay, now go to the create category and we can change this to entertainment. We had shopping, we had, what else we can add? We can add food, and this should be street food. Click send. You can see we get the food, street food icon and all these things. We can also, let me copy this, we can go to the read category. We have this read category. Do we have the read category? Nope, we don't have the reading a single category, but we do have delete category. Let's go to the delete category and let me change this and click send. You can see, and also we can see the read categories. Let's go to the read categories, click send. You can see we get all these categories, the savings and entertainment. This null is coming because I think I have used it previously, that's why. Alright, this ends our section. We have completed the mapping from one object to the another object. We have completely reduced our boilerplate code. We have used the Java library, the MapStruct library. Just like I said before, you can also explore other libraries like the model mapper or the JMapper. There are so many mapping libraries are there. You can just explore it. I have used the MapStruct library because it is widely used in the industry, and you will get used to it as you start working on the real world project. Looks like initially it will be a bit complicated or it will be a lengthy process, but once you start using it, it is very easy. All you have to do is just need to create an interface and it will automatically provide the implementation. You just need to provide the proper mapping, the source object and the destination object. That's it. Rest everything will be taken care by the MapStruct library. Alright, this is all about the converting one object to the another object. I hope you enjoyed this section. Let's continue in the next section.